Good morning. I'm Jenny Joyce here with Fox News Now. You can join us at 10 o'clock every morning. We'll be giving you live updates. The one story that we wanted to bring to your attention this morning is what Steve Keeley was covering all morning long. One man is dead. 7 others are injured after a violent night, including a 95-year-old was injured. Steve Keeley has the report.
A night of violence ended here on Rodman Street around 3 a.m. when a shooter came up to this porch, puts the gun up to this first floor window, and likely looks for somebody to peek out the window. It was where a 32-year-old man looked to see outside, probably lifting one of the mini blinds to see who was here, and he gets shot point blank in the chest by one of the 5 shots that goes through the screen, through the glass, and obliterates the mini blinds. Behind the 32-year-old, great-grandfather known as Mr. Johnny, 95 years old. He's laying on his couch. He gets hit by one of the bullets. Upstairs at the house and not hit, a 2-year-old. She's there with her 24-year-old mother and a 19-year-old man. None of them hit, but all hysterical as help comes quick.
I heard 3 shots, and when I carried them, I came to the door to see if I didn't see anybody. So I thought maybe somebody had shot up in the air or something. So I went back in the house and working on my computer. Then I heard a young man come out a few minutes later hollering, "Somebody please call the police." Said, "Somebody been shot." I said, "What happened?" He said, "Somebody shot through his window."
This shooting happened just 10 blocks from a previous shooting here at 60th and Spruce, where 3 people were shot outside, one of them extremely critical. And as that's going on, the same police officers rush to another scene here in West Philadelphia, again, just about 7 minutes from where we're standing now, where this shooting happened, and a man is hit or falls to the street during a robbery, and he is dead here at Lancaster and Wyalusing Avenues. All the violence here in West Philly happens after 2 previous acts. A man at 65th and Wyncote in West Oak Lane leaves his girlfriend's house, and he is shot, and extremely critical, where police don't know if he would live. They don't know why he was shot. And then earlier at Einstein Hospital, a man shows up, shot there. Police go to where he says he was shot. They don't find the scene. 5 violent acts, 1 dead, 7 men shot, all within 3 hours after midnight. Back to you.
Thanks, Stephen. In other news, the westbound lanes of the Pennsylvania Turnpike were closed this morning after a single car crash caused a chain reaction, leaving 1 man dead. It happened around 3 a.m. Police say a car overturned on I-76 and 3 people exited the car and they were walking on the roadway. A second car stopped to help before a UPS tractor trailer struck both cars, and one of the men that was in the overturned car was hit and he died. The 2 other men from that car then fled the scene. State police are still looking into that. And members of Congress may be buckling up their seatbelts this morning, preparing for what could be an explosive hearing. Our Doug Luzader has the story.
Peter Strzok will be back on Capitol Hill today, and he is none too happy about it. In a prepared statement obtained by the AP, he is calling today's hearing just another victory notch in Putin's belt. But here's the real issue for Strzok: numerous text messages that he exchanged with former FBI lawyer Lisa Page, with whom he was involved. And this one in particular. Trump's not ever going to become president, right? Right? No, he won't. We'll stop it. Republicans see that as a smoking gun.
Let's make very clear. Strzok was not a low-level operative. He was number 2 in counterintelligence. He was up at the highest levels. We've got to make sure that at those levels, you can't have people tweeting, "We'll take care of an election. We have an insurance policy. We'll make sure this doesn't happen," especially when they're involved in this.
And the president is piling on, tweeting, "How can the rigged witch hunt proceed when it was started, influenced, and worked on for an extended period of time by former FBI agent, lover, Peter Strzok? Read his hate-filled and totally biased emails, and the answer is clear." An inspector general found Strzok showed political bias, but found no evidence that it led to anyone spiking the Hillary Clinton email investigation, a point Democrats will certainly try to hammer home today. This as Republicans are still trying to get Lisa Page to give her side of the story, a subpoena battle that is still underway. Yeah, and Page may ultimately be held in contempt if she doesn't show up. We'll see how that plays out. But, Mike, to your point, one of the defenses that Strzok will present today is that he did take shots at a number of other people, not just Trump. He was critical of Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, you name it. Look, bottom line is if you're using a company phone or an agency phone in this instance, you got to assume that somebody's looking at all your texts. It's an important lesson for all of us.
And how many people work for the FBI? It's thousands and thousands and thousands. Yeah. And to say that all of them are absolutely apolitical is silly. But you can't be doing this stuff. I mean, texting his girlfriend.
A South Jersey man remains in the hospital after catching a flesh-eating bacteria infection. We had his daughter on Good Day Philadelphia to talk a little bit about what happened and how he's doing now. Here's that segment.
Story that's getting attention around the country. It's out of our area. South Jersey man remains in the hospital after catching a flesh-eating bacteria infection.
Doctors had feared they would have to remove the man's arms and legs just to save his life. And it all started with a day of crabbing in Cumberland County, and this was on July 2nd. 60-year-old Angel Perez was in the water just outside of Millville. The next day, his daughter noticed he had some swelling near some scratches that were on his right leg. A few hours later, he began breaking out in blisters. His family rushed him to the hospital where doctors diagnosed him with the quick-spreading infection.
His daughter is with us right now, Delina. Delina, thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
Well, first of all, how is he now?
He is day by day getting better.
Yeah.
To me, he's getting better. His spirits are still positive. He has faith. He's praising God. He is being a jokester. He's being humorous. He is. He's still in a lot of pain. I can see it in his face and his eyes.
Well, let's go back and figure out what is going on here. He's been crabbing how many times in his life, do you think?
I couldn't even count.
Well, how many years? Like
maybe 14, 15 years,
Oh,
probably all
so
his life.
Hundreds of times.
Yeah.
and in Cumberland County?
Yeah, in the same spot. That's
Same
his.
spot.
That's his spot to go. He goes early in the morning. He tries to beat everyone before they get there because that's his spot.
Yeah. So where is it again? Is it an
Matt's
inlet? It's
Landing.
not out in the ocean.
No, it's more a bay area. There's a dirt road on either side. There's water. We usually just park the car
Is that
there.
it?
Yeah, that's it.
So you go into the water, right? It's just not on the bank. You go into the water how far?
You really don't have to go that far in as long as you have the sticks in. But over time, the water comes in, so it can go up to your kneecaps.
You say he had some scratches to begin with on his leg?
I don't know if they were there prior to him going crabbing, but that's where my stepmom actually seen the swelling. It was in the right ankle, and there were scratches above that.
So he comes home like he normally does after he goes crabbing. And how long did it take before you guys was like, okay, this is serious. We need to do something
He
about
said
this?
it. He said it. He said it. I have some swelling. He was telling my grandmother that his leg was hurting. It was hurting. It was hurting. So that's when they decided to take him to urgent care.
Okay, so you sent us some pictures yesterday how it looks right now. I mean, it's really bad, but now the flesh is starting to separate on his leg, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Before we talk to you about what you've heard from your doctors, we have Dr. Mike on the phone, right? Dr. Mike, can you hear us?
Yes, I can, my friend.
So, what is this?
Well, from published reports, I think he has Vibrio cholera, which is a bacteria that is fairly common at this time of year. In fact, I treated someone last week for Vibrio. Now, Vibrio is it's a bacteria that you can get in brackish water where a river meets the ocean. Many people contract it from eating raw shellfish. But you can also get it. You can also get it from.
Okay, we lost him there, but is that basically what the doctors have told you?
Yes. I believe they came to me the second day once we arrived at Cooper, and they gave me a name for it, and I started researching it, and it made sense.
So we think it's the brackish water that infected him, not something he ate. By the way, he doesn't even eat crabs.
He likes crabs, but usually when he catches them, he gives them away to everyone. It's just really he likes the hobby of catching them, and he gives them away to family members. And at one point, my stepmom didn't even know how to make them because she didn't really cook them, so she just learned how to make them recently.
And earlier you mentioned that it does seem like he's getting better. Does that mean doctors believe that he'll be able to keep his limbs, or is that still a very big concern that he might lose them?
It's still a very big concern. I think that we're starting to see him progress with his movements and his hands and his feet and his toes, and I think that we are trying to stay as positive as possible, and I really don't like to talk to doctors about amputation around him, so we're pulling them outside and talking about that, because I know when they took the tube, the breathing tube out, he just said, they're not going to take my legs, don't take my legs.
It got that bad they had to put
Well, they had to do the air tube because they had to do surgery on the right leg to release all of the fluids that was in there that was building up. It was really ugly. It
seems to me they would have to make a decision fairly quickly then.
Yeah, there's been so many people coming in and out. Everyone has been very supportive, and I just want to continue to work with Cooper to do the best that we can do for my dad.
How has this been for you, watching your dad? He loves crabbing. He's been doing it for 15 years, and to see this happen to him.
I mean, he's a man of many trades.
Yeah.
You know, he is wonderful to everyone around him. He is a great person in and out, and he really doesn't deserve this. So I think for me, it's really difficult, not only for me, for everyone. And my stepmom has been there through thick and thin, and she continues to stay there through thick and thin. And to see him go through this, it just makes me really upset because I don't have anyone to blame right now. Like,
he's a man of faith, though, isn't he?
Absolutely. The whole entire family has been coming from Puerto Rico, from Florida, from all over the place to let him know that we're here for him. And it's really a big deal. And Cooper Hospital has been so flexible and has been so supportive in allowing us to have as much family as we have. It's been like a reunion for something that is negative, but it's something good.
Yeah. And I'm sure that's why he has good spirits, because he's his family there with him.
Mm-hmm.
Give our best to your whole family.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
If you
And
need
keep us
anything,
updated.
let us know.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay.
And now we're taking a live look back in D.C. The House Judiciary and Oversight Committee about to hold a hearing. We are expected to hear testimony from embattled FBI agent Peter Strzok. He was once at the center of the Hillary Clinton email probe and the Russia influence investigation. He's firing back at lawmakers who have questioned his anti-Trump text messages. We're going to leave you with this live picture into the hearing.
Good morning. The committees on the Judiciary and Oversight and Government Reform will come to order, and without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. We welcome everyone to this morning's hearing on oversight of FBI and DOJ actions surrounding the 2016 election. Before we begin, without objection, the MOU that Mr. Gowdy and I entered into will govern these proceedings. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee.
Mr. Chairman, I want to express my appreciation to the staff for preparing all sorts of parliamentary objections, which we will not use. But I appreciate the chairman consulting with us on the MOU, and pursuant to our conversation, I do not object.
Chair thanks the gentleman. And Chair recognizes himself for the purpose of an opening statement. I wish this hearing were not necessary. Many children grow up wanting to become FBI agents, to catch bad guys and protect the American people. I have little doubt that our witness today has done that very thing during his many years serving as an FBI special agent. A special agent's mission is a vitally important business to which we dedicate some of our best and brightest. However, this is precisely why our joint investigation is such an anomaly. We want the FBI and the Department of Justice to be off the front pages and to return to doing what they are best at, battling crime, terrorism, and espionage, and protecting all of us from harm. We don't want to read text message after text message dripping with bias against one of the two presidential candidates. We don't enjoy finding compelling evidence that the FBI director had predetermined the outcome of the case months in advance. But that is, thus far, what we have found, and these are only small pieces of the larger puzzle. The more information we acquire, the more interviews we conduct, and the more sources we contact, the more we learn. It has unfortunately taken a great deal of effort to get our executive branch agencies to cooperate with our legitimate congressional oversight. But we have made substantial progress, and it is a credit to our investigative task force members and staff. For all those in this room who continue to disparage our investigation as mere conspiracy theory, and for all those who have chosen to ignore serious irregularities and potential crimes that we have uncovered, I say this: imagine if you were under investigation and the investigator hated you, disparaged you in all manner of ways, and fraternized with another employee working on your case who also hated you, denigrated your supporters, and made crucial investigative decisions on how your case should be treated and eventually adjudicated. Would anyone sitting here today believe that this was an acceptable state of affairs, particularly at an agency whose motto is fidelity, bravery, and integrity? I think not. To my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, please replace President Trump's name with your own name in a small sample of things Mr. Strzok has said. Envision how you would feel if you found out that the chief agent investigating you as a member of Congress was making these statements: F Trump. Trump is a disaster. Just went to a Southern Virginia Walmart. I could smell the Trump support. Or perhaps most alarmingly and revealingly, we'll stop it, referring directly to Mr. Trump's candidacy for president. In fact, for those who think we are wasting time in this committee, suppose all of this had been said about candidate Obama before he was elected, or even more topical, about Hillary Clinton while she was running in the same election. Would we be where we are today? The only honest answer is an absolute affirmative yes. Of course we would be here, because every single Democrat would be protesting bias and discrimination against their preferred candidates by an out-of-control FBI and DOJ. So please stop saying this doesn't matter and is only the product of conspiracy theory. Instead, the American people hope you will understand that this investigation goes to the very heart of our system of justice, one that is supposed to be fair and treat everyone equally under the law. Mr. Strzok and others inside the FBI and DOJ turned our system of justice on its head, and that's why we're here and why this matters. Yesterday, Chairman Gowdy and I received a letter from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle raising numerous objections about the nature of our investigation. These claims are largely spurious, and I have responded publicly to them before. However, these claims are also revealing. The final line of that letter states that our Democratic colleagues will, quote, undertake efforts to protect their rights, end quote. I implore my friends not to continue their efforts to undermine this investigation. And as for their rights, I submit that the rights that should concern us are the rights of the American people, namely to know the facts, to trust that their law enforcement agencies are operating fairly and justly, and to feel secure in the knowledge that no one is above the law. I now recognize the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I must say before I begin my formal statement that this country has a number of emergencies right now under the jurisdiction of this committee, which we're not spending any time or any attention to. The leading one, obviously, being the fact that 3,000 children were improperly taken away from their families, and the administration seems either unwilling or, out of total incompetence, unable to return the kids to their families, even under court order. We ought to be holding hearings about the intentions or the competence of the Department of Homeland Service, of the Department of Homeland Security on this question. Mr. Chairman, it's of more immediate concern than this hearing, certainly. At the outset of this Congress, when my Democratic colleagues and I asked you to hold hearings about the Russian government's campaign to undermine our last election, you said no, and you offered a variety of excuses. We could not look into President Trump's overt attempts to obstruct the early stages of the Russian investigation because, you said, quote, there are other committees that have jurisdiction over part of this, unquote. You were also reluctant to interfere with the special counsel, quote, until Mr. Mueller's investigation is complete, it is redundant for the House of Representatives to engage in fact-gathering on many of the same issues. You also insisted that the House Judiciary Committee would never intrude on an active criminal investigation, claiming, perhaps erroneously, that the majority never questioned the FBI about the Clinton investigation while that investigation was still ongoing. Mr. Chairman, this joint investigation is now so far afield from the original statements that it can be difficult to discern what we are investigating at all. You initially described this inquiry as, quote, an investigation regarding charging decisions in the investigation surrounding Secretary Clinton's email server in 2016, close quote. Just a few days ago, over the course of an 11-hour interview, Republicans asked Mr. Strzok more than 200 questions about the special counsel's investigation, more than 30 questions about Mr. Strzok's personal interactions with the special counsel, and 25 questions about the FBI's use of confidential human sources, to determine who at the Trump campaign might have been compromised by a foreign government. Are we no longer going to wait until Special Counsel Mueller concludes his work, Mr. Chairman? Or perhaps the rules of this joint investigation, such as they are, operate differently now that we are approaching the midterm elections and Special Counsel Mueller is closing in on the President's close associates. In the majority's view, it seems, our job is to ask questions about the internal workings of the Special Counsel's investigation and to demand documents that lay out his strategy, but not to make any attempt to understand how the Russian government influenced our last election or any effort to protect our next election from an attack by the Russian government, a key foreign adversary. In the majority's view, it is more important to quiz Mr. Strzok about the FBI's use of confidential human sources in some wild attempt to prove President Trump's baseless claim that a, quote, spy, unquote, was planted inside his campaign, than it is to learn about the impact of exposing the identity of these sources while they are still working undercover. My Republican colleagues appear to have revealed the identity of at least one such source already. In the majority's view, the text messages exchanged between Mr. Strzok and Lisa Page are a higher priority for us than President Trump's request that James Comey end the investigation into Michael Flynn, or his decision to fire Director Comey, quote, because of that Russia thing with Trump and Russia, unquote, that's a quote from the President, or his repeated attempts to fire Special Counsel Mueller directly. In the majority's view, We do not have time to conduct oversight on almost any national security issue, but we have hours on end to discuss Mr. Strzok's affair. Which brings me to my next point. I have come to expect that President Trump will tweet abhorrent things about decent people, but I hope I can expect better behavior from my colleagues. Mr. Strzok volunteered to be here today, just as he volunteered to appear 2 weeks ago for what turned out to be an 11-hour interview. You don't have to like him, but you have to treat him and any witness before this committee with respect. Questions like, do you love Lisa Page? And who did you vote for in the last election? Questions that presidents posed in his interview are not relevant to any aspect of our official business. I would say the same of the majority's treatment of Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein on June 29th, which was at best uncivil, and of the committee's treatment of Lisa Page, which has been unfair to say the least. Mr. Chairman, I agree with you that Ms. Page must eventually comply with a duly issued subpoena, but it is beneath your office to suggest, as you did this week, that her decision not to appear for deposition means, quote, she has something to hide. It is beneath our committee to call her pathetic, as Mr. DeSantis did. It has nothing to do with the swamp, as Mr. Jordan suggested. Can we not be decent to our witnesses, Mr. Chairman? Must Republicans descend to the president's level, even in his defense? I know that the majority wants a public fight with Mr. Strzok today. I expect that they will ask him questions about the special counsel's investigation that you know the FBI will not permit him to answer, as you did more than 200 times in our last meeting with Mr. Strzok, so that his decision not to answer in instructions by the FBI not to answer can be played out on cable news again and again. And I expect that Mr. Strzok walked into this room knowing that Republicans may soon call for him to be held in contempt for following the long-standing policy of the Department of Justice. FBI agents like Mr. Strzok should not comment on or even acknowledge the existence of an ongoing criminal investigation. A single decision to deviate from that protocol can cause lasting damage to our republic, as anyone who has read the Inspector General's report and his conclusions about Mr. Comey's deviations from that protocol must acknowledge. When we reach that impasse, Mr. Chairman, I hope you will think back to the statements you made about interference with the special counsel earlier this Congress and consider the consequences of our words and actions here today. The majority keeps telling us over and over again that there was bias in the Clinton investigation, bias in the Russian investigation, and that bias must never again affect an investigation at the Department of Justice. The rules that prevent Mr. Strzok from answering some of the questions today are designed to accomplish precisely that, to prevent Congress and the public from injecting bias in to prevent Congress and the public from injecting bias and politics into the special counsel's investigation or into any other investigation. When the special counsel's job is done, I invite all of us to join in examining his findings. Until then, Mr. Chairman, I hope we can treat our guests with common courtesy and leave the special counsel alone to do his job. I yield back.
The Chair thanks the gentleman, and it's now my pleasure to recognize the Chairman of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Gowdy, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In our justice system, we give law enforcement officers incredible powers. The power to investigate, to search, to seize, to stop, the power to allege and accuse, the power to eavesdrop and intercept private communications, the power to look through bank records, the power to look through phone records, the power to even check what books you checked out of the library. These are awesome powers that must be used responsibly because those powers affect reputations and freedom. These awesome powers are given a correspondingly high expectation that these powers will be used fairly, lawfully, professionally, and in a manner worthy of our respect. About 2 weeks ago, FBI agent Peter Strzok was interviewed for more than 10 hours. We learned that Agent Strzok has a most unusual and largely self-serving definition of bias. Agent Strzok, despite the plain language of his texts and emails, despite the Inspector General's report, and despite common sense, doesn't think he was biased. He thinks calling someone destabilizing for the country isn't bias. He thinks promising to protect the country from someone he hasn't even begun to investigate isn't bias. He thinks promising to stop someone he is supposed to be fairly investigating from ever becoming president isn't bias. He thinks talking about an insurance policy to keep someone from becoming president isn't bias. That's for one of the folks he was investigating. He has a different set of rules for others that he's investigating. Agent Strzok thinks saying someone he is allegedly investigating should be elected president 100 million to 0 before he ever interviews her. He doesn't think that's bias. Agent Strzok thinks pronouncing someone innocent before bothering to interview more than 30 different witnesses isn't bias. He thinks claiming you can smell the Trump supporters isn't bias, but he doesn't say a single solitary word about being able to smell the support of any other candidate. To him, that isn't bias. The moment Special Counsel Bob Mueller found out about Peter Strzok's texts and emails, he kicked him off of the investigation. But that was a year and a half too late. The text and the emails may have been discovered in May of 2017, but the bias existed and was manifest a year and a half before that, all the way back to late 2015 and early 2016. So it wasn't the discovery of texts that got him fired. It was the bias manifest in those texts that made him unfit to objectively and dispassionately investigate. So if the bias existed in late 2015 and early 2016, and it did, his unfitness to investigate existed then as well. Agent Strzok struggled to define bias for the better part of 10 hours. For the rest of us, bias is the prejudging of a person, a group, or a thing. It usually has a negative connotation, but it is a preconceived position or a prejudgment. It is the making up of your mind ahead of time based on anything other than the facts, and that is exactly what he did. Bias is saying Hillary Clinton should win the presidency 100 million to 0 when she was still under investigation, wasn't even the nominee, hadn't been interviewed, and 30 other witnesses had also not been interviewed. In March of 2016, Agent Strzok had Clinton winning 100 million to 0, even though the investigation was far from being over. That is the prejudging of someone's innocence before all the evidence is in. On the other hand, he said Trump would be destabilizing, called him an idiot, abysmal, bigoted nonsense, called him a disaster, said he should F himself. Strzok promised to stop Trump from becoming president before the investigation even began. He talked longingly of Trump resigning 2 months after he was inaugurated and well before the special counsel investigation even began. Strzok even talked about impeachment the day special counsel was appointed. That is prejudging guilt, it is prejudging punishment, and it is textbook bias. We live in a 50-50 country, and we accept that. But we're a 100% country when it comes to having law enforcement that doesn't prejudge innocence before investigations are over and doesn't prejudge guilt and punishment before an investigation even begins. Agent Strzok had Hillary Clinton winning the White House before he finished investigating her. Agent Strzok had Donald Trump impeached before he even started investigating him. That is bias. Agent Strzok may not see it, but the rest of the country does, and it's not what we want, expect, or deserve from any law enforcement officer, much less the FBI. A fair, bias-free investigation is not a Republican or Democrat issue. It's an American issue, or at least it used to be.
Chair thanks the gentleman and recognizes the ranking member of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings, for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. When Chairman Goodlatte and Chairman Gowdy launched their joint investigation into Hillary Clinton's emails, They promised not to interfere with the ongoing criminal investigation being conducted by Special Counsel Mueller. They were crystal clear. Let me read some of their statements. On December the 6th, Chairman Gowdy said, and I quote, "I specifically communicated to Special Counsel Robert Mueller I would not wittingly or unwittingly interfere with an ongoing criminal probe," end of quote. On March 18th, Chairman Gowdy said, and I quote, "I've been really very clear. Leave him alone. Let him do his job," end of quote. Chairman Gowdy went on to offer advice directly to the president. And this is what he said, and I quote, "My advice to the president is the same thing I just told his lawyer. Give Bob Mueller the time, the independence, and the resources to do the job." He went on to say that when you are innocent, if the allegations of collusion with the Russians, and there's no evidence of that, and you are innocent of that, act like it, end of quote. This was the advice that Chairman Gowdy gave to the President of the United States of America. And let me be very clear, I have a tremendous amount of respect for the Chairman of the Oversight Committee. Chairman Goodlatte echoed those comments, declaring that he and Chairman Gowdy had, and I quote, "no intentions of interfering with the substantive investigation of Mr. Mueller," end of quote. But now they are doing the opposite. Behind closed doors, they're asking individuals involved in the Russia investigation hundreds of questions about confidential human sources, FISA applications, and potential witnesses in the Special Counsel's criminal probe. In public, they're holding emergency hearings, issuing unilateral subpoenas, and threatening contempt and impeachment. They even demanded that the top Justice Department law enforcement officer in charge of this investigation, and I quote, "finish it the hell up," end of quote. So what has changed? What has changed? Why did our chairman promise not to interfere wittingly or unwittingly, but then suddenly launch this aggressive attack against our special counsel? There has been one obvious development. The special counsel has now obtained 5 guilty pleas and indicted 18 others, including some of President Trump's closest advisors. Here are the individuals who are already admitted their guilt. Michael Flynn, President Trump's national security advisor. He pleaded guilty to lying about his secret communications with the Russians, making false statements to the FBI, and impeding the investigation while he worked at the White House last year. Let me underscore, these are not allegations. These are admissions. President Trump's national security advisor admitted that he committed these crimes, and he is now cooperating with the special counsel. Rick Gates, President Trump's deputy campaign chairman, he pleaded. there rules of that, Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Chairman, is there...
Are there any rules
point of order,
against what they are doing? Cite the rule. Cite the rule if there's a rule against what they are doing. Cite the rule.
Names, faces, titles, and the rule and the word guilty.
The gentleman may proceed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me underscore, these are not allegations. These are admissions. President Trump's top national security advisor admitted and he committed these crimes, and he is now cooperating with the special counsel. Rick Gates, President Trump's deputy campaign chairman, he pleaded guilty to, quote, conspiracy against the United States of America, end of quote, to intentionally engaging in a variety of criminal schemes and to lying to the special counsel and the FBI last year and even this year. He admitted to committing those crimes. He is also cooperating with the special counsel. George Papadopoulos, President Trump's foreign policy advisor, he pleaded guilty to making false statements to the FBI in 2017 about when he first learned that the Russians had dirt on Hillary Clinton. Also now cooperating with the special counsel. Richard Pinedo, digital marketing strategist, pleaded guilty to identity fraud and trafficking in hundreds of stolen bank account numbers over the internet, which were bought by Russians to interfere with the 2016 election. And Alex van der Zwaan, the son-in-law of a Russian oligarch, pleaded guilty to lying to special counsel and the FBI in November about his work with President Trump's campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, for foreign nationals aligned with Russia. Of course, this does not include Mr. Manafort himself, who is scheduled to begin his criminal trial later this summer. He is sitting in solitary confinement after allegedly engaging in witness tampering. This also does not include Michael Cohen, the president's longtime lawyer. At this moment, he may be considering whether to cooperate with special counsel. At the last Judiciary Committee hearing, Chairman Gowdy said that if the special counsel has evidence of a crime, he should submit it to the grand jury. As Chairman Gowdy himself said, if you are innocent, act like it. Today, I urge our chairman to change course and to keep their promises to protect the integrity of the special counsel's ongoing investigation, and instead of asking hundreds of questions that undermine it, to work with him. And with that, Chairman, I yield back.
We welcome our witness. And Mr. Strzok, if you would please rise, I'll begin by swearing you in. Do you swear that the testimony that you are about to give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. Let the record show that the witness answered in the affirmative. Mr. Peter Strzok is a Deputy Assistant Director of the Human Resources Division of the FBI. Mr. Strzok has worked at the FBI for approximately 22 years. Prior to his current assignment, he was a Deputy Assistant Director in the Counterintelligence Division. It was his assignment in that division that brings him before the committees today as we continue our investigation. Your written statement will be entered into the record in its entirety, and we ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. To help you stay within that time, there's a timing light on your table. When the light switches from green to yellow, you have 1 minute to conclude your testimony. When the light turns red, it signals your 5 minutes have expired. Mr. Strzok, you may begin.
Chairman Goodlatte and Gowdy, Ranking Members Nadler and Cummings, thank you for the opportunity to testify before your committees again, this time in an open hearing. I testify today with significant regret, recognizing that my texts have created confusion and caused pain for people I love. Certain private messages of mine have provided ammunition for misguided attacks against the FBI, an institution that I love deeply and have served proudly for over 20 years. I'm eager to answer your questions, but let me first address those much discussed texts. Like many people, I had and expressed personal political opinions during an extraordinary presidential election. Many contained expressions of concern for the security of our country, opinions that were not always expressed in terms I'm proud of. But having worked in national security for 2 decades and proudly served in the U.S. Army, those opinions were expressed out of deep patriotism and an unyielding belief in our great American democracy. At times, my criticism was blunt, but despite how it's been characterized, it was not limited to one person or to one party. I criticized various countries and politicians, including Secretary Clinton, Senator Sanders, then candidate Trump, and others. But let me be clear, unequivocally and under oath, not once in my 26 years of defending our nation did my personal opinions impact any official action I took. This is true for the Clinton email investigation, for the investigation into Russian interference, and for every other investigation I've worked on. It is not who I am, and it is not something I would ever do, period. I understand that my sworn testimony will not be enough for some people. After all, Americans are skeptical of anything coming out of Washington. But the fact is, after months of investigations, there's simply no evidence of bias in my professional actions. There is, however, one extraordinarily important piece of evidence supporting my integrity, the integrity of the FBI, and our lack of bias. In the summer of 2016, I was one of a handful of people who knew the details of Russian election interference and its possible connections with members of the Trump campaign. This information had the potential to derail and quite possibly defeat Mr. Trump, but the thought of expressing that or exposing that information never crossed my mind. That's what FBI agents do every single day, and that's why I'm so proud of the Bureau. And I'm particularly proud of the work that I and many others did on the Clinton email investigation. Our charge was to investigate it competently, honestly, and independently, and that's exactly what happened. I'm also proud of our work on the Russian interference investigation. This is an investigation into a direct attack by a foreign adversary, and it is no less so simply because it was launched against our democratic process rather than against a military base. This is something that all Americans of all political persuasions should be alarmed by. In the summer of 2016, we had an urgent need to protect the integrity of an American presidential election from a hostile foreign power determined to weaken and divide the United States of America. This investigation is not politically motivated. It is not a witch hunt. It is not a hoax. I expect that during this hearing, I'll be asked about that ongoing investigation. Where the FBI has directed me not to answer, I will abide by the FBI's instructions. But let me be clear. This is not because I don't want to answer your questions. If I were permitted to answer, I would. And the answers would doubtless be disappointing to the questioners and undermine the conspiracy narrative being told about the Russia investigation. I understand we're living in a political era in which insults and insinuation often drown out honesty and integrity. But the honest truth is that Russian interference in our elections constitutes a grave attack on our democracy. Most disturbingly, it has been wildly successful, sowing discord in our nation and shaking faith in our institutions. I have the utmost respect for Congress's oversight role, but I strongly believe today's hearing is just another victory notch in Putin's belt and another milestone in our enemy's campaign to tear America apart. As someone who loves this country and cherishes its ideals, it is profoundly painful to watch and even worse to play a part in. Mr. Chairman, I welcome your questions.
We will now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions. I'll begin by recognizing the chairman of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, Mr. Gowdy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Agent Strzok, the FBI investigation into potential Russia collusion with the Trump campaign began on July 31st, 2016. You drafted the originating document. You approved the originating document. You were the point of contact on the originating document, and the FBI has represented to Congress that nothing from an investigative standpoint with respect to Russian collusion and the Trump campaign began before July 31st, 2016. But 10 days before the investigation even began, 10 days before you drafted the originating document, approved the originating document, was the point of contact on the originating document, 10 days before the investigation began, which the department you work for says nothing was done before July 31st. You said Trump is a disaster. I have no idea how destabilizing his presidency would be. And because you struggled a couple of weeks ago with a word that I thought had a commonly accepted definition, I'm going to go ahead and give you the definition of destabilizing. The first one kind of is obvious. It's to make unstable. The second one caught my attention, the second dictionary definition. To cause something such as a government to be incapable of functioning or surviving. That's a pretty significant allegation to make 10 days before you even began to investigate someone. So that was before July 31st. I want to ask you in that first week, we'll go ahead and up it to 8 days, between July 31st and August 8th, how many interviews did you conduct related to the alleged collusion between Russia and the Trump campaign? So, Congressman, as you know, counsel for the FBI, based on the special counsel's equities, has instructed me not to answer questions about the ongoing investigation. I'm asking for a number. Russian attempts to interfere. Agent Strzok, I'm asking for a number. I haven't gotten to the names. How many people had you interviewed between the beginning of it on July 31st and August the 8th? It's an 8-day time period. We're a week into an investigation. How many people had you interviewed? Congressman, I understand your question. I appreciate it, and I would very much like to answer. But as I've stated, as you know, that counsel of the FBI, based on the special counsel's equities, have directed me not to answer any questions about the ongoing investigation into Russian attempts to interfere.
The gentleman will suspend and the clock will suspend. Mr. Strzok, you are under subpoena and are required to answer the question. Are you objecting to the question? If so, please state your objection.
Mr. Chairman, I object.
The gentleman does not have standing to object. There is no point of order. No point of order here. The
point of order, it should be heard.
The gentleman will state his point of order.
My point of order is that intentionally or otherwise, this demand puts Mr. Strzok in an impossible position. He is still an employee of the FBI, and FBI counsel has instructed him not to answer the question. If we have a problem with this policy, we should take it up with the FBI, not badger Mr. Strzok.
The gentleman's point of order is not well taken.
It's right on point.
No, it's not. Mr. Strzok, are you objecting to the question? And if so, please state your objection.
Mr. Chairman, two things. One, I do not believe I am here under subpoena. I believe I am here voluntarily. Second, I will not, based on direction of the FBI to me, based on that, I will not answer that question. Because it goes to matters which are related to the ongoing investigations being undertaken by the special counsel's
Mr. Strzok,
office.
you have not stated a valid legal basis for not responding to a question directed to you by a member of the United States House of Representatives, and you are overruled.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Let me continue. Your testimony is essential to this hearing, and to our oversight and information gathering functions with regard to the actions taken and decisions made by the Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Investigation in 2016 and 2017, I am specifically directing you to answer the question in response to our subpoena, notwithstanding your objection.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Strzok, please be advised that you can either comply with the committee's directive to answer the question.
Being undertaken by the special
Mr.
counsel's
Strzok,
office.
you have not stated a valid legal basis for not responding to a question directed to you by a member of the United States House of Representatives, and you are overruled.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Let me continue. Your testimony is essential to this hearing and to our oversight and information gathering functions with regard to the actions taken and decisions made by the Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Investigation in 2016 and 2017. I am specifically directing you to answer the question in response to our subpoena, notwithstanding your objection.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Strzok, please be advised that you can either comply with the committee's directive to answer the question or refuse to do so, the latter of which will place you at risk of a contempt citation and potential criminal liability.
Point of order.
Do you understand that?
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
The question is directed to the witness.
And I have a point of order before he answers the question.
The point of order is not well taken until...
You don't know what the point of order is. You can't say it's not well taken.
The point of order, the witness will answer the question.
Mr. Chairman, I raise my point of order, and I insist on it.
What is the point of order?
The United States Attorney's Manual instructs department personnel not to respond to questions about the existence of an ongoing investigation or comment on its nature or progress. In a letter to Congressman John Linder in 2000, referred to as the Linder letter, the department made this policy explicitly applicable to requests from Congress. Quote, although Congress has a clearly legitimate interest in determining how the department enforces statutes, congressional inquiries during the pendency of a matter pose an inherent threat to the integrity of the department's law enforcement and litigation functions, unquote. Therefore, the question being directed at the witness is out of order. The witness's declination to answer it as against the instructions of the FBI pursuant to FBI policy, which is necessary so as not to allow us to subvert an ongoing criminal investigation. He is right. He should not answer the question.
The gentleman has not stated a valid point of order.
I will appeal the ruling of the chair in that case.
Nonetheless, the United States Supreme Court has recognized that it is unquestionably the duty of all citizens to cooperate with the Congress in its efforts to obtain the facts needed for intelligent legislative action. It is their unremitting obligation to respect the dignity of the Congress and its committees and to testify fully with respect to matters within the province of proper investigation.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, you know, or we all know, that if we were to ask a question of a witness about a military secret, if we were to ask him, how does the H-bomb work, he could not answer that question. This is the same thing.
That is a classification issue, not an issue of whether or not this is a valid question for which...
I appeal the ruling of the chair. He has ruled that it's not a point of order.
That is not a ruling. Mr. Strzok?
Mr. Chairman, I insist on my point of order, and I insist on appealing the ruling of the chair.
Mr. Strzok, knowing the advice that
Point
I
of order,
have given
Mr.
you,
Chairman. Point of order. I believe there's a point of order that's been raised, and you've ruled we have a right now to answer Mr. Nadler's.
It is not a valid point of order. The chair has
already repress it, Mr. Chairman, because you don't.
On that ruling.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Strzok.
Mr. Chairman, I appeal the ruling of the chair that you have just made on that, on whether the...
You have not stated a valid point of order.
And that is your ruling, and I appeal it.
That is not an appealable...
Point of order. Yes, it is, Mr. Chairman. Appealing the ruling of the chair is exactly what he's requesting. He's appealing it. That requires a vote to either sustain it or overrule it.
The gentleman from New York has not cited a rule of the House that is being violated. Therefore, it is not a point of order.
That's your
ruling. That ruling of the chair.
Mr. Chairman, is it not appropriate to also interject the attorney-client privilege, which cannot be overridden, and is a rule of the House to the extent that witnesses have the right to an attorney-client privilege in this House. And that is what this witness is asserting, attorney-client privilege, and he has been advised not to answer the question.
The gentleman will suspend. The gentleman has not raised the attorney-client privilege. He has said that he's been instructed by the FBI not to answer the question. Now,
by lawyers.
He knows the advice I have just given him. If he would like, I'll restate it. But knowing this, will you answer the committee's question as directed, or do you refuse to answer the committee's question?
Point of parliamentary inquiry,
the ruling of the chair that
point of parliamentary
order
inquiry
was not in order.
Point of parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from South Carolina has the time. A parliamentary inquiry is not in order during the gentleman's time. The chair is instructing the witness to answer the question, and the question to you is,
Mr. Chairman,
will you answer the committee's question as directed, or do you refuse to answer the committee's question?
Mr. Chairman, I move to adjourn.
Second.
You're not recognized for that purpose.
Mr. Chairman, I think you have no choice but to recognize such a motion.
I do not have.
Are you just going to make up rules as we go along?
The motion is not in order during the time controlled by the gentleman from South Carolina.
I appeal that ruling of the chair.
Mr. Strzok, will you
Chairman,
answer?
I appeal your ruling of the chair that my motion to adjourn is not in order.
The gentleman is not in order.
That may be, but I appeal your ruling.
The gentleman is not recognized. Knowing this, will you answer the committee's question as directed, or do you refuse to answer the committee's question?
Mr. Chairman, as you know, counsel for the FBI has directed me not to answer questions about the ongoing investigation. As you also know, counsel for the FBI is sitting here behind me. May I consult with them?
You may consult with your own counsel.
But I may not consult with the FBI's counsel?
Only with your own counsel.
Mr. Chairman, there's no basis for that. He can consult with the FBI counsel. He's an FBI employee.
The gentleman is not recognized.
And the chairman is not being proper.
The chairman is being proper.
The witness can't be directed not to confer with his attorney.
The FBI is not his attorney. His attorney is seated behind him. If he wishes
He's an employee of the FBI,
as he's already done, he may do so.
And his attorney may consult with the FBI attorney?
Isn't the privilege that of the FBI, and shouldn't the FBI counsel be solicited on that point?
Just take that over right now. Let Trey. Let's get this out. Let's just get this out, and then we'll go back here.
Mr. Chairman, my counsel has reiterated that counsel for the FBI has directed that I may not answer that question.
Mr. Strzok, in a moment we will continue with the hearing, but based on your refusal to answer the question at the conclusion of the day, we will be recessing the hearing, and you will be subject to recall to allow the committee to consider proceeding with a contempt citation.
A point of order, Mr. Chairman. Will the committee also consider contempt for Mr. Bannon, who refused to answer Mr. Gowdy's questions when he was actually under subpoena?
That is not a proper point of order in this hearing.
Parliamentary inquiry.
Mr. Gowdy, do you remember
Parliamentary inquiry.
The time is controlled by the gentleman from
Parliamentary inquiry.
A parliamentary inquiry is not in order when the gentleman from South Carolina controls the time.
Agent Strzok, just so the record's clear, because it's been a little while, I didn't ask you the content of those interviews. I didn't ask you the names of who you interviewed. I asked you whether or not you interviewed anyone from July the 31st until August the 8th. And I find it interesting that the FBI will tell us no interviews were conducted before July 31st. That apparently doesn't impact an ongoing probe. But between July 31st and August 8th, it does. Here's the good news. I already know the answer to it. I went and looked at the file. The first interview that I can find is on August the 11th of 2016, which is 11 days after it began, which makes me wonder, on August the 6th, so you hadn't interviewed anyone, you're investigating this alleged Russian collusion with the Trump campaign, you're the lead investigator, you originated the investigation, you're the point of contact, you drafted the document, And here you are before you've interviewed a single solitary witness saying F Trump. Then that same day, your colleague, Lisa Page, wrote, maybe you're meant to protect the country from that menace. And you responded, I can protect the country at many levels. We're not even a week into an investigation that you originated, approved, were the contact for. You hadn't interviewed a single solitary soul until August the 11th, and you're already promising to protect the country from that menace, Donald Trump. And then on August the 8th, you still hadn't interviewed anyone. You're 8 days into your Russian collusion with the Trump campaign investigation, and you got another text from your colleague, Lisa Page. Trump's not ever going to become president, right? Right? And you replied, no, he's not. We'll stop it. By the time you promised to stop him from becoming president on August the 8th, how many interviews had you conducted?
Mr. Gowdy, so two answers to that. One, with regard to how many interviews had or had not been conducted, I've been directed by counsel for the FBI not to answer that question. Second, sir, I think it's important to take those texts in the context of how they were written and what they meant.
And someone may ask you that question, Agent Strzok, but I didn't. I asked you how many people you interviewed before you wrote it. If you want to get into context, let one of my other colleagues do that with you. Here's what I want to know. Who's the he and he's not?
He is then candidate Trump.
So when you said, no, Donald Trump's not, in connection with the question, going to become president, what's the it?
Chairman
we'll
Gowdy.
Stop it.
Chairman Gowdy, that text needs to be taken in the context of
I'm asking, look, if you want to have a debate over a two-letter word, we're going to have to do that some other time. What and who did you mean by it?
Mr. Gowdy, as I've stated, that text was written late at night in shorthand.
I don't care when it was written.
About.
I don't care
What's
whether it was
important
longhand, cursive. I don't care about any of that. I want to know what it meant, Agent Strzok.
It would be his candidacy for the presidency, and my sense that the American population would not vote him into office.
Right. Well, we hadn't gotten to the will yet.
Well, I'm trying to cut to the chase and explain the text.
The will is the American people. Is that right? That's your testimony. The will stop it. You were speaking on behalf of the American people. Is that correct?
Mr. Gowdy, what my testimony is and what I said during extensive asking of this question during my prior interview is I don't recall writing that text.
Are you denying writing the text?
What I can tell you is that text in no way suggested that I or the FBI would take any action to influence the candidacy of
Agent
candidate
Strzok,
Trump.
that is a fantastic answer to a question nobody asked.
Yeah, Mr. Gowdy, you asked what I meant.
My question to you is
Chairman,
the
the
wheel.
going to be permitted to answer the question being posed?
After the conclusion of Mr. Gowdy's questions, if there is a question that he has not had the opportunity to answer, he will be given additional time to do that. The witness will.
Well, you look forward to that.
So your testimony.
His time has expired, Mr. Chairman.
Your
by
testimony
2.5 minutes.
It's going to be tough for me to get through it if I keep getting interrupted. Your testimony a couple of weeks ago was the we meant the American people, which I found confusing because on November the 7th, which is the day before the election, you said this. You were concerned that those same American people that you were speaking on behalf of might actually elect Donald Trump president. So you said, OMG, this is effing terrifying. I think we know what effing means. I'm pretty sure we have OMG down too. What was terrifying about those same American people you trusted to stop him in August, not stopping him in November? What was so terrifying about that, Agent Strzok?
Mr. Gowdy, I do not have a copy of the transcript. We have not been provided that transcript.
It's your text. It's not the transcript. It's your text.
Mr. Gowdy, what I would say in that is, one, I was not referring to the American electorate at all. The American electorate I respect in their decisions, and their right to vote is absolutely a cornerstone of our democracy. So at no time did I insult or call into question the the judgment or the power of the American electorate. What I was expressing in that text is my personal belief and my personal sense of how I saw and what I believed in the potential upcoming administration.
And see, that's what I find so confounding, because in August you blamed the we on the American people, that the American people would stop it, because you don't want it to be you and Lisa
Mr.
Page,
Chairman,
and you don't want it to be the FBI.
Are we not given 5 minutes to answer questions? We have indulged this harassment 9 minutes.
The
This
chair,
Judiciary and the Oversight Committee. I thought
the gentlewoman will suspend. The chair, in agreement with the ranking members of both committees, agreed that there would be liberality in the questioning by the chairman and the ranking members of each committee. The gentleman will continue.
What I find
Then,
confounding,
Mr. Chairman,
Agent
we
Strzok,
expect that liberality on every one of our questionings.
what I find confounding, Agent Strzok, is you were counting on the American people. That was the we you referenced in August when you said, we'll stop it. But the American people didn't stop it. He actually won. So then we go to March of 2017, and you're already talking longingly about him resigning. And then we go to the day that Special Counsel Mueller, well, before we go to that, that's March of 2017. March of 2016, you wrote, God, Hillary should win 100 million to 0. And I'm assuming Hillary would be former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton?
That's correct.
All right. In March of 2016, weren't you investigating her for potential mishandling of classified information?
We were.
Had you interviewed her yet?
No.
Had you interviewed more than 30 other witnesses that wound up being interviewed?
I would have to check the case file, but I'll take your representation.
Well, if she had said something incriminating in your interview that took place months later of her, would she have won 100 million to 0 then?
Likely not, no.
Well, then why wouldn't you wait until the investigation was over before you have her the nominee and winning a general election against an opponent that hadn't even been named yet? 100 million to 0, Agent Strzok? That's how bad she should win?
Mr. Gowdy, those personal expressions of my observing the political process of the presidential primaries had no bearing on my actions of any investigation, to include the investigation of Secretary Clinton.
You couldn't think of
or anybody else. Sir,
you couldn't think of a single person that would not vote for Hillary Clinton for president? 100 million to 0, Agent Strzok?
Sir, that was clearly hyperbole, which I...
Well, let's say it was hyperbole. Let's divide it by 10. How about we say it was hyperbolic and divide it by 10? 100 million divided by 10, I'm pretty sure is 10 million. 0 divided by 10 is still 0. You couldn't think of a single solitary person that was going to vote for her for president before you interviewed her and while you were supposed to be investigating her.
Congressman, clearly that's not the truth. Clearly I could envision millions of Americans who are likely and did vote for then candidate.
Well, you wrote it.
My point, sir.
Did you write it? Did you write that
I
text?
did write that, sir.
Okay. Were you under duress?
Political expression engaging in hyperbole.
Were you under duress?
Asked and answered over and over again.
The gentlewoman will suspend. The gentleman from South Carolina controls the time.
All right, we're going to go into one other time period. May 17th, 2017, Bob Mueller is appointed. Your friend Jim Comey's been fired. He's already leaked the memos to his law professor friend, and Mueller is special counsel. Do you remember how long it took for you to start talking about impeachment after Bob Mueller was appointed?
I don't, sir.
1 day. 1 day. And you were talking about impeachment. And for anyone who may have missed it the day after his appointment, Agent Strzok, you did it again 5 days later. Now, how many interviews had you done as part of the special counsel team within the first 5 days of his appointment?
Sir, again, same answer as before. I can't get into details.
Right, and the answer is also the same. It's 0. No interviews had been done.
I don't know if that's true or not.
No interviews had been done by August the 8th when you're talking about stopping him and how terrifying it would be for him to win and how you can protect the country. And no interviews had been done before you're talking about impeachment of the president. But no wonder
Chairman.
Bob Mueller kicked you off of the investigation, Agent Strzok. My question is, if you were kicked off when he read the text, shouldn't you have been kicked off when you wrote them?
Not at all.
Well, it wasn't the discovery of your text, Mr. Strzok. It was the existence of your bias that got you kicked off.
No, Mr. Gowdy, it wasn't. I do not have bias. My personal opinions in no way.
Well, then why did you get kicked off? Why'd you get kicked off?
Mr. Gowdy, my understanding of why I was kicked off was that based on an understanding of those texts and the perception that they might create.
Well, hang on a second, Agent Strzok. Hang on a second. Perception.
Integrity.
You're saying it was the perception. There are 13 Democrats on the special counsel probe, including one who went to what he hoped was a victory party. That's a perception problem, too. They weren't kicked off. You were. Why were you kicked off?
Mr. Gowdy, I cannot speak to Special Counsel Mueller's
How long did you talk to him?
The reasons why he did or didn't.
How long did you talk to him when he let you go?
Witness answer the question.
Witness will be afforded the opportunity to answer the question if there is a question he wants to answer after Mr. Gowdy's time.
My recollection, it was a short meeting, somewhere between 15 to 30 minutes, probably around 15 minutes.
And your testimony is Bob Mueller did not kick you off because of the content of your text. He kicked you off because of some appearance that he was worried about.
Sure. My testimony, what you asked and what I responded to, was that he kicked me off because of my bias. I'm stating to you it is not my understanding that he kicked me off because of any bias, that it was done based on the appearance. If you want to represent what you said accurately, I'm happy to answer that question, but I don't appreciate what was originally said being changed.
I don't give a damn what you appreciate, Agent Strzok. I don't appreciate having an FBI agent with an unprecedented level of animus working on 2 major investigations during 2016.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings.
Oh, point of order,
Mr. Chairman, can I respond to
answer the questions that you promised him he would have an opportunity to answer? We endured 15 minutes of badgering of the witness. Can he be allowed now to answer as you promised, Mr. Chairman?
The gentleman will suspend. The witness at any time can ask for additional time to respond to any member's question if the time has been
You
ended.
said you were going to give him that opportunity at the end.
I am giving him that opportunity.
Mr. Chairman, may I respond to?
Yes, you may.
Mr. Gowdy. Sir, I think it's important when you look at those texts that you understand the context in which they were made and the things that were going on across America. In terms of the text that we will stop it, you need to understand that that was written late at night, off the cuff, and it was in response to a series of events that included then candidate Trump insulting the immigrant family of a fallen war hero. And my presumption, based on that horrible, disgusting behavior, that the American population would not elect somebody demonstrating that behavior to be president of the United States. It was in no way, unequivocally, any suggestion that me, the FBI, would take any action whatsoever to improperly impact the electoral process for any candidate. So I take great offense and I take great disagreement to your assertion of what that was or wasn't. As to the 100 million to 1, that was clearly a statement made in jest and using hyperbole. I, of course, recognize that millions of Americans were likely to vote for candidate Trump. I acknowledge that is absolutely their right. That is what makes our democracy such a vibrant process that it is. But to suggest somehow that we can parse down the words of shorthand textual conversations like there's some contract for a car is simply not consistent with my or most people's use of text messaging. I can assure you, Mr. Chairman, at no time in any of these texts did those personal beliefs ever enter into the realm of any action I took. Furthermore, this isn't just me sitting here telling you, you don't have to take my word for it. At every step, at every investigative decision, there are multiple layers of people above me, the assistant director, executive assistant director, deputy director, and director of the FBI, and multiple layers of people below me, section chiefs, supervisors, unit chiefs, case agents, and analysts, all of whom were involved in all of these decisions. They would not tolerate any improper behavior in me any more than I would tolerate it in them. That is who we are as the FBI. And the suggestion that I, in some dark chamber somewhere in the FBI, would somehow cast aside all of these procedures, all of these safeguards, and somehow be able to do this is astounding to me. It simply couldn't happen. And the proposition that that is going on, that it might occur anywhere in the FBI, deeply corrodes what the FBI is in American society, the effectiveness of their mission, and it is deeply destructive.
Mr. Chairman, I have a motion. I have a Rule 11 motion, Mr. Chairman. Clause 2. I move to subpoena Steve Bannon Mr. Bannon was a witness in the House Intelligence Committee investigation. He was under subpoena. He refused to answer questions by Mr. Gowdy.
The gentleman is not recognized. The chair recognizes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr.
Chairman,
Cummings,
a motion
for his
is always
question.
in order. A motion is always in order, Mr. Chairman. It's Rule 11, Clause 2.
I will yield to Ms. Swalwell for 1 minute.
Mr. Chairman, I move to subpoena Steve Bannon. In our House Intelligence investigation, he was under subpoena. He refused a number of times to answer questions of Mr. Gowdy. Mr. Gowdy appears to have a sincere interest in getting to the bottom of what happened, and so I move under Rule 11 to bring Mr. Bannon to this committee. Also, Mr. Chairman is in receipt of Devin Nunes's letter to our committee recommending that the Judiciary Committee continue on the House Intelligence Committee's investigation into Russia and recommended witnesses. So I move now for consideration for Mr. Bannon to be subpoenaed. And if he refuses, for contempt proceedings to occur.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman,
Chair recognizes
I
the gentleman
object
from-
to consideration of the motion that is being made.
The
And I yield back to Mr. Cummings. But the motion has to be heard immediately, Mr. Chairman, under Rule 11, Clause 2.
gentleman will suspend. The motion is not germane, and the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings,
I move to
is
table the
recognized.
ruling of the chair. I move to overrule the ruling of the chair.
Mr. Chairman, I move to table the motion.
Motion been made to table the appeal of the ruling of the chair. All those in favor of tabling the appeal respond by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
No.
In the chair, the ayes have
Mr.
it.
Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
Point of
I ask for a
parliamentary inquiry, Mr.
recorded
Chairman.
vote.
Mr. Chairman, point of parliamentary inquiry.
Gentleman will state his point of parliamentary inquiry.
On the vote to table, or for that matter, on the vote to appeal the ruling of the chair, do we take separate votes of the two committees, or one vote of everything?
My understanding was that both you and Mr. Cummings were satisfied with one roll call vote. But we'll go through each committee in order, and then we'll take the cumulative vote after the conclusion of both committees.
I just wanted to clarify that point.
Mr. Chairman, I had asked for a recorded vote.
The recorded vote has been requested, and the clerk will call the roll. The question is on the motion to table the appeal of the ruling of the chair. The clerk for the Judiciary Committee will commence.
Mr. Goodlatte?
Aye.
Mr. Goodlatte votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Sensenbrenner votes aye. Mr. Smith? Mr. Smith votes aye. Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Issa? Mr. King?
Aye.
Mr. King votes aye. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Poe? Mr. Poe votes yes. Mr. Marino? Mr. Marino votes yes. Mr. Gowdy?
Pass.
Mr. Labrador? Mr. Collins? Mr. Labrador votes aye. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. DeSantis? Mr. DeSantis votes aye. Mr. Buck? Mr. Ratcliffe? Mr. Ratcliffe votes yes. Ms. Roby? Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. Rutherford? Mr. Rutherford votes aye. Ms. Handel? Ms. Handel votes yes. Mr. Rothfuss? Mr. Nadler? Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson Lee?
No.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen? No. Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Johnson of Georgia? No. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Deutsch? No. Mr. Deutsch votes no. Mr. Gutierrez? No. Mr. Gutierrez votes no. Ms. Bass? No. Mr. Richmond? No. Mr. Richmond votes no. Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Cicilline?
No.
Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Swalwell?
No.
Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Liu?
No.
Mr. Liu votes no. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Jayapal? No. Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Schneider? No. Mr. Schneider votes no. Ms. Demings? No. Ms. Demings votes no.
The clerk of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee will call the roll.
Mr. Gowdy?
Pass.
Mr. Gowdy passes. Mr. Duncan.
Aye.
Mr. Duncan votes aye. Mr. Issa.
I am aye for both committees.
Mr. Issa votes aye. Mr. Jordan. Yes. Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Sanford.
Aye.
Mr. Sanford votes aye. Mr. Amash. Mr. Gosar.
Aye.
Mr. Gosar votes aye. Mr. Desjardins. Mr. Desjardins votes aye. Ms. Fox. Mr. Massey. Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Meadows. Mr. Meadows votes aye. Mr. DeSantis. Mr. DeSantis votes aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross votes aye. Mr. Walker. Mr. Walker votes aye. Mr. Blum. Mr. Blum votes aye. Mr. Heiss. Mr. Heiss votes aye. Mr. Russell. Mr. Russell votes aye. Mr. Grothman. Mr. Grothman votes aye. Mr. Hurd. Mr. Palmer. Mr. Palmer votes aye. Mr. Comer.
Yes.
Mr. Comer votes yes. Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Gianforte.
Yes.
Mr. Gianforte votes yes. Mr. Cummings. Mr. Cummings. Mr. Cummings votes no. Ms. Maloney. No. Ms. Maloney votes no. Ms. Norton.
No.
Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Clay. Mr. Lynch. No. Mr. Lynch votes no. Mr. Cooper. No. Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Connolly.
Nay.
Mr. Connolly votes nay. Ms. Kelly. Nay. Ms. Kelly votes nay. Ms. Lawrence. Nay. Ms. Lawrence votes nay. Ms. Watson Coleman. No. Ms. Watson Coleman votes no. Mr. Krishnamurthy.
No.
Mr. Krishnamurthy votes no. Mr. Raskin. No. Mr. Raskin votes no. Mr. Gomez. Mr. Welch. No. Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Cartwright.
No.
Mr. Cartwright votes no. Mr. Desaulniers. No. Mr. Desaulniers votes no. Ms. Plaskett. No. Ms. Plaskett votes no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes no.
Mr. Chair, how is Mr. Gowdy recorded?
Mr. Gowdy passed.
The clerk will call the
Pass is
roll.
not a
of
vote.
the clerk of the Judiciary Committee will call the roll of members who have not yet been recorded.
Mr. Issa? Yes. Mr. Issa votes yes. Mr. Gowdy? Mr. Buck? Aye. Mr. Buck votes aye. Ms. Roby? Mr. Rothfuss? Aye. Mr. Rothfuss votes aye. Ms. Bass? Mr. Jeffries?
I've been asked by the minority and the majority council to advise members that their votes will only be counted once, if they're on both committees. And the clerk of the Oversight and Government...
Mr. Chairman, point of order. On what basis would that rule be, since each committee is voting separately on that?
Procedurally, we have agreed to one unified vote. The clerk of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee will call the roll of those members who have not voted.
Mr. Gowdy. Mr. Amash. Ms. Fox. Mr. Hurd. Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Clay. Mr. Gomez.
Yes, sir. He just responded to you.
The gentleman from Missouri. Gentleman from Missouri votes no.
Mr. Clay votes no.
The clerk will report. The clerk will suspend. The gentleman from Texas is recognized. Mr. Hurd of Texas votes aye.
Mr. Hurd votes aye.
The gentlewoman from North Carolina.
Mrs. Fox votes yes.
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, 38 members voted aye, 31 members voted no.
And the motion to table the appeal of the ruling of the chair is upheld. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings, for his questions.
Mr. Strzok, first of all, let me say this, that to the members of the FBI who may be watching this, I want them to be clear that we have the utmost respect for the organization. And I thank them for doing what they do every day and protecting our rights and protecting our people and protecting our way of life. And as I listen to you in answering Chairman Gowdy's questions, particularly at the end, you gave a very impassioned statement. But can you understand why there are members that question whether the thoughts that you may have, that you put in an email or text, might interfere with the investigation? I mean, can you understand at least the questioning of that?
Yes, sir, I do.
And I want to, and I know you're familiar with oaths because I'm sure you've taken them 50 million times, but I remind you that you're under oath, and I'm just going to ask you this. How do you square that? In other words, I understand the piece about there's so many layers that the FBI wouldn't even allow to happen, even if you wanted them to. But how do you take that, compartmentalize, I guess that's the best word I can think of, and then when you walk into that room, be neutral or independent or live up to your oath? Do you understand my question?
I do, sir.
All right. Can you answer that? Because I think that would be very helpful to me. And hopefully you are answering that question will be helpful to my colleagues. In fairness to all of us. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. Thank you. And I certainly do, sir, appreciate and understand that question and that concern, and why people would lick those texts and want to know why and how they should believe that those personal beliefs played any role in my official acts. What I can tell you, sir, is that, first, I, like every FBI agent, like every person in this room, like everybody watching, has a political opinion. And each and every one of those people in the FBI, whatever their political beliefs, walks in the door and they leave those behind. The FBI has a culture. It is in our culture, it is in our training, it is in our policy, and everything we do is dedicated to the pursuit of the facts where they lay and applying the law to those facts. There is no room for personal belief. It is something that is anathema to us. It is simply something culturally that doesn't occur, and were it to occur, it would be noted and stopped. And in addition to that culture, we have policies, we have procedures, we have laws, we have guidelines that are designed to provide outside checks and balances, to provide for outside review, to provide for any number of ways that the individual actions of any agent, any analyst, any support personnel are not acting in any way other than official policies and procedures. So when I tell you, again, as I did, personally what I believe and what I did, I understand why people may or may not have doubts or believe that, but then I would turn to you and say, look at the entirety of the rest of the organization, of the men and women who make it up, of all the things that are in place to ensure that our job in the FBI is to competently and independently pursue the facts wherever they are, and I cannot stress to you enough that is exactly what is done day in, day out, and that is exactly what has guided my behavior for over 26 years.
All right, thank you very much. Let me ask you this. In previous testimony to Congress, President Trump's FBI Director, Christopher Wray, explained the critical importance of protecting confidential human sources. And this is what he said, Agent Strzok, and I quote, "The day we can't protect human sources is the day the American people start becoming less safe," end of quote. Do you agree with that?
I do.
The problem is we now have the transcript of your 11-hour closed-door interview with our committees, and it shows that Republican members asked you repeatedly about confidential human sources involved in the Russia investigation. Is that correct?
My recollection is yes, sir.
Do you remember how many questions they asked you about that?
I do not, sir.
Let me read one of their questions from the transcript. One Republican member asked you this question, and I quote, "In the month of July, was there any information